Good morning. I should tell y'all that I forgot my shoes at home, so I'm not matching. So here we are. I'd like everybody to repeat after me. Childhood is about surviving adults. I want y'all to hold on to that as we take this horrific journey this morning. We often think about lynching as something that happened to Black men, and we often think about lynching as a uniquely American and Southern phenomenon. But white supremacy learned to kill early. It didn't wait for adulthood. It reached for the smallest bodies, the softest hands, for voices that had barely changed. It reached for the cradle and even for the unborn. In Maryland, it took the lives of young people who never had a chance to finish growing up. A boy named Frederick, age 13. Fred Goings, identified only as a young Negro. Mary Wallace, age 17. Edward Cosley, age 19. Medford Walters, age 18. Carol Gibson, female, age 18. Howard Cooper, age 15. John Berry, age 16. John Myers, age 19. Oddie Simmons, age 19. Garfield King, age 18. Alfred Sims, age 19. John Lampkin, age 19. William Andrews, age 17. Weldon Jones Jr., age 18. Leonard Shockey, age 17. Charles Whittle, age 19. Wiley Kirk, age 18. And let us not forget Judah. In 1834, this 14-year-old enslaved girl was hanged in Prince George's County. She was accused of setting fire to the Sully plantation house and of poisoning her enslaver's 3 children and killing them. The facts barely mattered. What mattered was the spectacle, Marilyn's desire to make an example of a child. They marched her to the gallows before a jeering crowd. She was a tiny figure in a borrowed dress surrounded by white faces that demanded her repentance. They told her to pray for forgiveness from the very people who had owned and abused her body. Then the state of Maryland killed her in public, right down by the National Harbor. The cruelty did not end with her death. As required by Maryland law at the time, the state paid her enslaver, Dr. John H. Bain, a former senator, $250 for compensation for lost property. Judah's body swung as a moral performance. Her death was closed a financial transaction. That is what passed for justice in a Christian democracy that professed to value innocence. Judah's execution was more than an isolated tragedy. It was a rehearsal for what would become an American ritual, the killing of Black children to reassure a white public that this world was still intact. From the gallows of Oxon Hill to the trees and bridges and lampposts and swamps across America, the same logic persisted. Judah's small body foreshadowed the smallest nooses. Every child who hung after her was part of the same grim lineage. In my forthcoming book, Strung Up, How White America Learned to Lynch Black Children, I write that this country lynched teenagers. It lynched young adolescents. It lynched toddlers learning to speak. It lynched infants who had barely opened their eyes to the world. In at least 9 cases that I've documented, it lynched the unborn, still in their mother's wombs that were burned alive, riddled with bullets, or cut out as the crowd cheered. These were not accidents of mob fury. They were deliberate messages. Each act of violence against a child was a declaration that no Black life at any stage was sacred. Lynchings were not just public executions, they were rituals of instruction. For white children, they were lessons in power. For Black children, they were lessons in terror. And both were shaped by it, neurologically, spiritually, culturally, because white supremacy destroys all children. Because the target was never just the man hanging in the tree, it was the child beneath it. It was the family that had to keep living after. It was generations who weren't supposed to remember. Imagine the weight of living in chronic fear where a glance, a word, being in the wrong place at the wrong time could unleash a horror, a shooting, a mutilation, a burning, a public hanging. Imagine raising your child in a country where one misstep or doing nothing wrong at all can get them shot, hanged, or burned in the street while other people's children watch and learn. Imagine the soul-wrecking agony of having your child snatched from the future and their murder not only unpunished, but mocked in newspapers, printed on postcards, etched in local lore. Imagine watching your child's killers go on about their lives, promoted to sheriff, elected to office, celebrated as pillars of the community, tucking their own children into bed at night, untouched by consequence or conscience. In Strung Up, I do not write a eulogy for Black childhood. It is an autopsy of whiteness, a dissection of how racial violence became ritual and how white people were socialized into cruelty and learned to perfect the art of killing children. Now, take a look at this image. It's the inaugural 1910 issue of The Crisis, edited by W.E.B. Du Bois, who was not just a civil rights activist. He was a child advocate who affectionately referred to Black youth as the children of the sun. The 1910 issue opens with this striking cover image. It's a delicate line drawing of a Black child at play with a simple hoop in her hand and her face turned downward in quiet concentration. The image feels tender, almost ordinary, and that ordinariness was revolutionary. In a country that routinely caricatured and dehumanized Black children, Du Bois chose to begin his magazine, a record of the darker races, with an image of Black innocence, of curiosity, and youth. He was making a visual argument that Black childhood existed, that it was precious, and that it deserved protection and loving representation in the American imagination. But Du Bois was also deliberate about the tension between that image and the world that it was entering. In that same era, he would write with searing clarity, "There is no place in this world for Black children." His hyperbolic use of this world conveys the mean-spiritedness of mainstream life to the first generations of Black children growing up after emancipation. His use of this world was not despair for despair's sake. It was a moral indictment. He was naming the cruelty of the so-called civilization that claimed to value innocence, yet created no safe for Black innocents to live. That sentence captures the psychological violence of Jim Crow, where the very existence of Black childhood was treated as a social impossibility. Du Bois was telling the world that if such a sweet human image as a little girl at play could not be protected, then this nation itself stood condemned. Then he turned that condemnation inward and posed an agonizing question to his own people. Ought children be born to us? Have we any right to make human souls face what we face today? It is one of the most haunting questions in African American letters. Du Bois was not doubting the value of Black life. He was questioning a society that forced Black parents to bear the unbearable, to give birth into a world structured against their children's survival. It was both an existential and an ethical challenge, a demand that America look at itself through the eyes of the people that it had consigned to terror. And finally, Du Bois wrote, "In the treatment of the child, the world foreshadows its faith and future." That line is the hinge. For Du Bois, how a civilization treats its children, especially its most vulnerable, reveals its moral DNA. The treatment of black children was therefore a prophecy. Every lynching, every act of school segregation, every image of a child cowering before a mob was a signpost pointing to what kind of world America truly was and what kind of future it would have. Du Bois understood that the smallest bodies bore the greatest truths about a nation's soul. When black children were lynched, these were not aberrations. They were declarations of social order. The noose around a child's neck was America saying again and again, there is no place in this world for black children. The image on that first crisis cover issue of a child at play was Du Bois's rebuttal to that declaration. It was a visual act of resistance, a counter-narrative to the rope, the mob, and the burning tree. By placing that image on the cover of a magazine dedicated to truth and black progress, Du Bois was insisting on a different kind of future, one where black child could exist freely, where innocence was not a death sentence, and where the measure of civilization would be how fiercely it protected its children. Ongoing issues of the Crisis magazine repeatedly called on black people to love our children like a revolt. And yet, the century that followed proved Du Bois' prophecy right. In Maryland, that prophecy had already been written in blood many decades before Du Bois launched the crisis. In the treatment of the child, the world foreshadows its faith and future. Maryland's faith, like the nation's, was written in the language of terror, and its future was guaranteed through ritualized destruction of its youngest black lives. The names I called earlier are only a fraction of the young people lynched in America between 1861 and 1959. Their names survived, but countless others did not. Despite more than a century of scholarship on lynching, children have largely been overlooked or erased. Their names have been stripped of context and forgotten. But their murders were not random. They were strategic acts of racial terror designed to halt black progress at its source. To kill a child was to murder possibility itself, to send a warning that black life would never outgrow white control. When we fail to center black children in the story of racial terror, we misunderstand the entire architecture of white supremacy. Because black children were never just collateral damage. They were the point. Their very existence embodied a future that white supremacy could not contain. Each child lynched was a preemptive strike against black freedom. What we know and what we can't find also tells its own story. So the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project has confirmed 38 lynchings in the state. Yet the list of children and teenagers needs deeper exploration because their deaths live only in fragments. A headline, a census note, a rumor in the county, a rumor in somebody's family. The absence of these children from the official ledgers and memorials is the afterlife of the same violence that killed them. The noose was only one form of erasure. The forgetting that followed was another. Untold numbers now survive as blank spaces in the historical record where a name is listed but the story is gone from America's moral memory. Each missing record, each unverified age, each unmarked grave is evidence of how completely this country sought to erase the fact that its victims were children. It's a reminder that this history was meant to vanish with them. So when we gather the names, even without every date or detail, we are doing the sacred work Du Bois spoke of, restoring faith and future. We are insisting that these children existed, that their lives mattered, and that their stories, once buried, will no longer be lost to silence. In the treatment of the child, the world foreshadows its faith and future. Now, Du Bois wasn't only speaking to America when he wrote those words. He was indicting the civilization that birthed America, Europe, because that's where lynching began. For centuries, Europeans rehearsed the very logic that would become our smallest nooses. Before a black child ever swung in a southern town square, European children were being marched to scaffolds for moral instruction, beaten in churches and classrooms, paraded past severed heads in public hangings to learn obedience through terror. And white children were also hanged in Europe. The church declared children born sinful and need of breaking. Family life normalized pain as love. The state turned punishment into theater. Those cultural technologies of domination, coercive parenting, theological justifications, the normalization of pain, they all crossed the Atlantic, tucked inside Bibles and law books, braided into the habits at the hearth. They were also embedded in white people's bodies. Here they fused with anti-blackness, capitalism, and settler colonialism, and scaled up into a caste system where the spectacle of violence was not a deviation, but a design. This is why the lynching of black children was not an American accident. Lynching in America was an imperial inheritance. The same worldview that taught Europeans to treat their own children as property and their tenderness as weakness taught colonizers to see black childhood as disposable. It is a continuation of a long heritage of anti-child violence. Public executions became picnics. Discipline became doctrine. A white child's apprenticeship in cruelty became the ritual through which racial order reproduced itself. Lynching was the family heirloom, polished in public. Parents passing their children to the front row so they could learn not to flinch. And because those lessons were delivered during the most sensitive seasons of child development, especially brain development, they carved themselves into breath and reflex, into the nervous system, into what people mistook for instinct. Every lash, every sermon on sin, every execution attended by a trembling child rewired something in the collective psyche. Those children learned to survive by hardening. They learned to see pain as proof of righteousness, domination as divine order. And when they grew up, that conditioning became empire. The emotional calluses formed from centuries of domestic and state cruelty made it possible to enslave, made it possible to colonize, made it possible to steal land, made it possible to commit genocide, made it possible to lynch, to rationalize genocide while calling it all civilization. I like it when people talk back to me. It gets me going. What they inflicted onto others was the externalization of what had already been done to them as children. So when we talk about the intergenerational trauma of white people, we're naming the original wound of Europe's own anti-child culture, the mutilation of empathy that became the foundation of white supremacy. Empire was its therapy. Colonization was its relapse. Lynching was its ritual. Each generation reenacted the same pathology on darker bodies. They were trying to master what had once mastered them. And Du Bois saw it clearly. A world that trains its children through pain will always build systems that require somebody else's suffering to feel secure. We don't have this conversation about white people because the architecture of white supremacy depends on their innocence. The entire mythology of race in the West is built on the presumption that whiteness is purity, rationality, civility, and therefore incapable of being pathological. To interrogate what lynching did to white people neurologically, emotionally, spiritually would mean admitting that they were not just perpetrators, but casualties of their own system. That the violence they enacted outward was first rehearsed inward. That's a terrifying mirror, and Western history has never been willing to look into it. The scholarship on lynching has largely centered on the Black body as victim, as symbol, as spectacle, because that is where the brutality is most visible. But whiteness functions precisely by keeping its own trauma hidden, by projecting all that pain, fear, and depravity onto the other. To study the psychic damage of white supremacy to white people would mean confessing that the plantation, the gallows, and the cross were not just tools of domination, they were coping mechanisms for a civilization built on abuse. We avoid this conversation because it dismantles the moral scaffolding of Western civilization itself. It would mean that colonization wasn't simply greed or ideology, but an intergenerational reenactment of domestic violence, a civilization-wide repetition of compulsion. Freud talks about the compulsion to repeat when people are traumatized. It would mean that lynching wasn't just racial hatred, but a learned ritual of purification inherited from European child-rearing, church doctrine, and state punishment. To ask what lynching did to white people neurologically is to expose the biological cost of their own mythology. It means acknowledging that centuries of cruelty reshaped the brains and blunted empathy, heightened threat response, conditioned domination as pleasure. Your president. I call him the Orange Menace. I can be political. It means admitting that whiteness is not a state of health, but of trauma and inherited neurosis disguised as moral superiority. I'll pause so these wonderful people can get comfortable. I've got plenty more where that came from. And because modern scholarship, media, and even psychology have long been shaped by whiteness itself, we have no cultural framework for naming white pathology as pathology. We can analyze Black pain endlessly, but we're not allowed to analyze white sickness. The result is a one-sided moral archive. The wounds are always ours. The explanations are always theirs. But to understand lynching, or empire, or slavery fully, we have to turn the gaze around. We have to treat whiteness not as a neutral baseline, but as a site of historical damage, a culture disfigured by its own violence. Because the story of racial terror is not just about what white people did to Black people, it's also about what white supremacy did to white people, and how that unhealed trauma still drives the need to dominate, the need to control and destroy today. What we saw on January 6th wasn't a rupture. It was a remembering. The news anchors kept saying, "This isn't America." I kept looking at the screen. And I had just come out the archives the day before, and I was like, the hell it is. But every rope, every chant, every convulsing red-faced body told the truth that this has always been America. The noose outside the Capitol wasn't an anomaly. It was an heirloom. Those gallows didn't appear out of nowhere. Nobody handed out blueprints that morning. They knew how to build them because that knowledge was never lost. It's the same ancestral muscle memory that once strung up children from trees, that lit torches over courthouse lawns, that posed for photographs beside charred bodies while clutching their own children. When those white mobs stormed the Capitol, roaring, foaming, smearing feces on the walls, wearing animal pelts and medieval headdresses, they weren't acting out of some sudden political delirium. They were reenacting an old ritual of domination that did not begin in this country. The Capitol became another theater of the same ancient performance, the belief that violence can restore equilibrium, that terror can reassert hierarchy, that the same theology that killed Judah, that strung up other teenagers in Maryland, that taught white children to watch a black child burn and feel righteous. January 6th was the contemporary expression of that lineage, a mass of unhealed white bodies trying to regulate centuries of inherited trauma through spectacle. The guillotine. They bought a guillotine. I was like, how do they know how to do that in this century? A guillotine. The guillotine assembled on the lawn was not just prop theater. It was medieval muscle memory, a reflex of a culture that has always turned to ritualize punishment to feel whole again. You could hear it in the roar of the crowd, the ancient, ecstatic cry that once rose over the bodies of black men, women, and children. Make no mistake, January 6th was a lynching mob. Yes, it was. And now here we are, standing in a nation that looks eerily familiar. We are living in a moment where the ghosts have stepped out of the archives and taken human form again. I always get paranoid when I come out of the archives after looking at lynching stuff and I gotta go to Whole Foods. Gotta check myself. She's just buying goji berries, Stacey. It's real, I need therapy sometimes. A racist administration sits on the throne of chaos, feeding its base the same theology that hung Judah and that strung up so many other young folks and that put the noose outside the Capitol. Make no mistake about this. They are priming their followers to lynch again. We are not watching politics, ladies and gentlemen. We are watching a mass reinduction ceremony into the cult of white supremacy. We are watching the reconsecration of the noose. And that's why our work, this gathering today, this remembering, this naming, this is why it all matters. Because the smallest nooses are tightening again. One law, one speech, one wink at a rally at a time. And so, like Du Bois, we must ask again, ought children be born to us? I heard that question years ago when Trayvon Martin was killed, right? There were so many headlines where there were black mothers, even white parents who had biracial or adopted black children were asking this question, right? Or pregnant women saying, I hope I don't give birth to a son. We are still asking the same ethical question that Du Bois asked more than a century ago. Ought children be born to us? And what kind of world are we birthing them into? Because the answer will depend on whether we finally have the courage to break the cycle, to name the sickness, to treat the trauma, and to stop mistaking violence for faith. When people talk about reconciliation and healing, I have to admit, sometimes it often feels like they're asking black people to make peace with ghosts that are still killing us. How do you reconcile with a country that never confessed? How do you heal when the wound is still open? When the killers were never named, never punished, never even whispered about in polite company. For those of us who live in the echoes of that terror and loss, reconciliation sometimes sounds less like mercy and more like erasure, like an invitation to just move on while the ground beneath us still reeks of the unburied. I have lived inside that echo. My adoptive great-grandfather was brutalized by the Klan in Mississippi in the early 1920s. He was wrapped in sheets and left his body thrown right in front of his wife and children. My biological grandfather was found hog-tied, beaten, and shot in a New Jersey swamp in 1969. I have the photos. His killers walked free, and one of them, the killers, lives right here in the state of Maryland. When people talk about healing, I wonder which of these ghosts they expect me and my people to forgive first. And this is why I have no illusions about justice for the Black child victims of lynching. Our families still live with the empty air where laughter should be. Every mother, sibling, and descendant carries that hollow space in the body where a life should have stretched forward. That absence is not some distant memory. It's a living presence. It rearranges households. It shortens goodbyes. It tightens grips. It shapes love into vigilance. Joy becomes a measured thing, rationed carefully against what might be taken from us next. At the communal level, the trauma becomes infrastructure. You learn not to trust systems meant to protect you because you know they were built to destroy you. The school, the courtroom, the police station, the church. Each becomes a site of survival strategy. You build your own systems of care, beautiful, but born of necessity, always carrying the reminder that safety here must be self-made. The most corrosive part is the looping ache, this question, what if? What if they hadn't been lynched? What if we left earlier? What if we hadn't moved to that neighborhood? That question becomes inheritance. It rewires the body. It turns hypervigilance into instinct, tenderness into fear. This is how intergenerational trauma writes itself into our DNA. The body never forgets. And yet, even in that damage, something sacred still survives. Memory refuses to die. Out of the ache grows witness. Archivists, activists, storytellers, folks you'll hear from today, mothers who turn mourning into testimony. This is where true healing begins, not in national ceremonies or polished apologies, but in the radical act of remembrance. But we must be clear, remembrance is not justice. Dirt, monuments, and museum walls cannot balance the scales. America does not repent, it recycles. It buries its crimes beneath flowers and press releases and calls that healing. Du Bois asked, ought children be born to us? And y'all, my answer after everything is still yes. Yes, because those lynched children saw what this nation truly is and they still reached for the sunlight. Yes, because our children are the rebuke to the rope, living, laughing, learning, daring to exist. Yes, because every Black birth is an act of defiance and a declaration that the rope did not win. Reconciliation, if it ever comes, will not come from the state. So y'all can just abandon all hope for that. It will come from us, from the ones who remember, from the ones who name, from the ones who refuse to let the silence become our inheritance. That is the work. That is the pulse of repair. And it begins by refusing to let this country mistake our survival for its redemption. For nearly a century, scholars have dissected lynching from every conceivable angle: demography, geography, jurisprudence, iconography. We've cataloged bodies, we've mapped counties, we've studied the grain of the photograph, the crowd, the spectacle. We've debated the definition of mob. We've debated what constitutes a lynching, but the dead don't care. All of this has orbited around the Black victim, who is frozen in pain, objectified in death, while the white perpetrators have remained curiously unexamined. Their psychology inheritance is largely untouched. The study of lynching has become, in many ways, another way of looking at Black suffering without interrogating white pathology. Once again, it's time to turn the lens around. White people must confront their own history of trauma and abuse, not as a side note, but as the central mechanism that sustains racial violence. The question is no longer simply what was done to Black people, but what was done to white people to make them capable of killing other people's children. What kind of intergenerational damage, religious conditioning, and emotional mutilation shaped a culture that could find joy, catharsis, and spiritual renewal in the public destruction of children? That's the question we need to be focused on. White violence did not emerge in a vacuum. It was cultivated in homes, in churches, in classrooms. Lynching was not just racial. It was an extension of domestic violence that went down in white households. I have a chapter in my upcoming book about lynching and pedophilia. Oftentimes, a lynching began with a white father, brother, uncle, stepfather, sexually abusing a white girl child in the home, in the community, and it ended with the castration of an innocent Black man or boy. So lynching, ladies and gentlemen, how we look at it, how we talk about it, must evolve from forensic to psychoanalytic, from sociological to developmental, how white children are destroyed, from counting bodies to tracing the emotional and neurological inheritance of empire. We must ask how white childhood was deformed by violence and repression, how parental brutality, spare the rod, spoil the child, religious terror, and patriarchal hierarchy conspired to make cruelty feel natural. How the inability to feel, to empathize, to love without domination became a racialized neurosis passed down through generations. We must expose the architecture of white violence. And until white people confront their own history of being brutalized by the systems that they then turn outward, they will keep reenacting it under new names: policing, punishment, patriotism, making America great again. True reconciliation, if it's even possible, begins with white people studying themselves, their childhoods, their churches, their fears, their gods. Because the real story of lynching in America is not just about what they did to Black folks, it is about what they did to themselves, and they have refused to heal. And this ultimately brings us back to W.E.B. Du Bois, who affectionately referred to Black youth as the children of the sun. In the treatment of the child, the world foreshadows its faith and future. He saw clearly that a society that teaches its children domination will always reproduce domination. A people who confuse violence with virtue will always build their future on blood. And unless white America finally turns that gaze inward to confront not only what it has done to black adults and children, but what it first did to its own, the prophecy of Du Bois will remain unbroken. Thank you. Got time for questions? Sure, because we got time. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. I would have never came here except for you. You made it possible for me to deal with this bullshit. Thank you, Dr. Patton. Thank you so much.
That right there is everything. Because doing that work is lonely and hard. Doing it while you know your country is trying to lynch you. I feel that pain. So thank you. I'm supposed to take questions now. I'm sorry. I'm good. I'm good. Questions, comments? I tried to stay under my time. That was a miracle. Yes.
Take the mic.
Thank you. And the I really want to read the chapter in your book where you talk about I just can't help but think about Mary Turner, and I just wonder how you would approach incorporating her story into that narrative that you were just sharing with us.
So the lynching of Mary Turner, Valdosta, Georgia. She was pregnant. She was 8 months pregnant. And her husband, and these are people who just came out of adolescence, by the way. People never really talk about their ages. Her husband had been lynched. There was the white people went crazy and lynched quite a few black folks. And she declared that she was going to get justice for her husband. And the crowd white mobs heard about this, and they dragged her out of her home while she was 8 months pregnant. And they hung her upside down, riddled her body with bullets, and somebody took a knife that you use for splitting hogs and cut her stomach open. The fetus fell out, was still alive, and one of the members of the mob crushed the child's head. And it was just awful. And for years, I had always wondered, how did we know all of those graphic details of what happened? And I looked and looked and looked. And certainly these people would not have confessed to the media all these gruesome details that they did. And I kept digging, and I found the answer. It was a 10-year-old boy who was hiding in a cornfield who saw everything, a black boy. And he held on to that. I can't remember exactly what year he passed away, but this was very recent. And his daughter said that till the end of his life, he talked about that, and he was forever haunted. So this was a child witness who brought forth this story to the crisis, to our understanding, our memory of what happened. It was a child who had to witness that horrible thing. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. One of my biggest questions I deal with my wife and I, we talk about this tremendously in our platforms, in our communities and things like that. But in my field, I'm like one of the only types in my field, very, very few. How on earth do we move forward in communicating this intensity into our professional communities, and still manage to keep our economics together where we can continue to move forward with our personal lives, as well as the memory and the history and the remembrances and the transformation that we need for these type of activities being recognized?
That's a very long and layered and complex question. For me, the answer is not some academic methodological approach, because we are people that have to stay alive and survive. When people ask me questions like this, my simple answer is, I'm not an enslaved woman on a plantation picking cotton every day. And it really is a reminder to me that my people have gone through much worse. That I am alive, that you are alive, because somebody had the audacity to survive the Middle Passage. Somebody survived a brutal whipping. Somebody survived Tulsa and Greenwood. Somebody maybe escaped a lynching. Somebody put their son inside of someone else's casket in Mississippi and drove them out of town to Chicago to prevent a lynching. So I think about those stories of resilience and audacity and communal care, and I stay in the archives and I draw on the stories and the strength of our people. And I remind myself that I'm not facing all of that horror just yet, but I draw on their strength and their techniques and tactics to move forward. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but, and sometimes it's just, let me get through this day. Mm-hmm. Yes, right next to you. Right here in the front.
Hi, Dr. Patton.
Hi.
It is such a pleasure to just be in your presence. I got to listen to your, I believe, autobiography, That Mean Old Yesterday. And when you were drawing the connections between, like, childhood abuse and slavery with children and just this idea of, like, productivity and how that leads to our present with Black children and their place in the world. It really helped me understand what was happening with the young, brilliant minds that I've been able to connect with in Baltimore here and DC and so many other places. Something that's been keeping me up at night probably this entire calendar year, but it's like ramping up and up and up, is our children now with AI being pushed on all of us. And I know it's like a layered and like, but how, I don't even know how to ask this or whatever, but this is the current thing that we're facing that's hurting all of us, but always our children, always our Black children. So I'm just wondering, in efforts like this that we have here to educate each other on our histories, and my heart is also like yours to protect our children. Like, what do we do when they're actively blocking ways of critical thinking and trying to expedite so-called productivity, right, with something that is destroying and destructive?
So lynching performs social work. It's not always bloody. It's not always brutal. It doesn't always require a rope, a noose, a burning, a lynch mob, right? And so my next book talks about the other kinds of social work that lynching does. It takes on different forms. They can't round us all up and do that violence. They can't put us all in prisons. You have to understand what you're talking about, which is the impact of digital addiction and such on brain development. It's all by design. I recently gave a workshop called Your Brain Has Been Hacked. And I teach digital media literacy to journalism students, and I do visual journalism, multimedia storytelling, all of that. And what I have been seeing with college students is a diminished capacity to think critically, to imagine, to tell stories, to access language, to problem solve. And when I first started, I was at Morgan State teaching, and the faculty, these at the time were all boomer faculty, and I was much younger, and they would say, these kids today are lazy, they're not reading, they're this and that, and I'm like, no, something else is going on. So it's communal trauma, it's trauma in the home with corporal punishment, emotional issues, things that are putting families under stress, and it's the cell phones, it's software, right? It's apps. And these tools were designed by tech bros in collaboration with people who understand neuroscience and developmental psychology. So everything you see, from the auditory cues, the alerts, to the color psychology, all of that stuff is embedded, and it is designed to keep you hooked. And that every time you pick up a cell phone, you are creating a neurobiochemical reaction in your body. It affects everything from your eyes to your brain to your kidneys, the way you breathe, your reproductive organs, libido, all of that. We could have a whole nother keynote on that. So it's all of that. And these people who design these technologies do not let their own children interface with them because they know what it does. So now, how is this connected to lynching and our ongoing problem with racial destruction of young people? So the demographic projections say that America is quickly headed toward a majority people of color future, right? And they can't stop that. So what do? If you want to ensure that young people of color and their allies don't grow up to develop the cognitive potential and capabilities to think, to write, right, to solve problems, to dismantle old hierarchies and systems of injustice, to create something new? Well, you put them in neighborhoods that peddle dead food, so apartheid food systems. You stress their teachers out so that they don't have the capacity to do trauma-informed pedagogical, techniques and such, right, like yourself. You feel overwhelmed by it. You wonder if you're making a bit of difference, and then you go on Facebook and you see these testimonies of teachers who are like, that's it, I'm done. I used to love doing this, but something has changed, right? So you do all of that, and then you put these weapons of mass distraction in front of their faces. And the parents do it very early on in the critical period of brain development. They have no idea that this tablet in front of their 2 or 3-year-old's face is changing the physical architecture of their brain. So you do that to ensure that legions of children of color cannot create something new. They can't collaborate. They don't have the social skills. They can't come together in community to even be aware that there are problems that need to be dismantled. That's what you're seeing, and it's on purpose. And then we get to last November when a fascist is elected as president and everybody's apathetic. What do? I can't go to work today. I'm so depressed. But as a historian, I was like, I told y'all, this is familiar. Well, what do? We go back to the archives. The answers are there. And we have to educate parents and communities about how digital devices are the new smallest nooses. Yes. And I say this as someone who embraces technology, who understands it, who teaches it to my students, as people who tell stories, that we need to harness these tools, these energies, but be aware of what it does to the body.
Dr. Patton, I have civil rights fatigue waiting on white people to evolve and mature on race. How do you do it? How do you live in this society every day as a black woman? I'm living here in society as a black man. Could you give me some tips? Because I'm sick of them. Tired of their mediocrity.
Dr. Patton, it's over here.
The eyes, the light is blinding me, so where are you?
30 seconds.
Okay. I would answer this very quickly with one word: divest.
I have a quick question. What age should we start teaching our children about lynching? And I ask that because as someone with grandchildren, their parents felt they shouldn't even come to a conference like this with me. So I want to know, is there an age you recommend?
Well, I just told you that this country lynched babies, the unborn, toddlers, adolescents, teenagers, right? This is part of our heritage. Tamir Rice was 10 years old, right? And so this is a perennial question, and I'm sorry, I got to take 1 minute to answer this. Du Bois grappled with this. Do we shield our kids, or do we tell them the truth? We must tell them the truth, right? Because this is their reality. This is a reality that our ancestors, had to live through. You can do it in age-appropriate ways. I'm not sure exactly how you talk about a lynching in a, less soft way, maybe sparing some of the graphic details and the imagery until their brain is, evolved enough to understand this. But this is a conversation that we must have because it is not old history. We're living in a moment where it could happen again to a 5-year-old or a 10-year-old. So it's a good question. I wish I had longer to be more eloquent about this, but our silence on this will not keep us safe, including our children. All right, thank you.